Before we dive in, viewer discretion is advised. The following account is crafted purely for entertainment, a dramatic retelling meant to capture the imagination rather than document any real event. What you're about to witness is a heightened, electrifying clash, one that explores what happens when a titan of comedy, a living legend, steps under the bright lights of a morning show only to be blindsided by a host with an unmistakably sharp, calculated agenda. The tension didn't merely rise, it crackled in the air the moment Eddie Murphy, Hollywood royalty, comedy trailblazer, and a man whose very presence commands attention, stepped onto the stage of The View. From the audience's perspective, it seemed like a celebratory moment. But beneath the polite applause and the polished smiles, a collision course was already set in motion. No one, not the viewers, not the panel, and perhaps not even Eddie himself, could have predicted the explosive force with which this interview would detonate. This wasn't simply another celebrity appearance drifting slightly off script. This was something far more volatile, a lesson, almost chilling in its clarity, on how swiftly a conversation can unravel when professional respect is tossed aside like yesterday's cue cards. But before dissecting that jaw-dropping moment, the kind that leaves comment sections in flames and social media timelines divided, it's important to start where the energy first shifted. Eddie walked into the studio radiating that signature charm, effortless, warm, disarming in the way only decades of experience can refine. His smile seemed to brighten even the harsh studio lights. He extended his hand to the panel with the calm assurance of a man who has weathered every storm the entertainment industry could conjure. Whoopi Goldberg, Sarah Haynes, Anna Navarro, and Sunny Hostin greeted him with unmistakable admiration. Even through the cameras, viewers could sense the reverence, a mix of excitement and nostalgia reserved only for legends whose work has shaped entire generations. "We've been anticipating this all week," Whoopi beamed, her eyes wide with genuine delight. And she meant it. The energy in the room reflected the anticipation of hosts who knew they were about to sit across from someone whose artistry had influenced comedy, film, and culture on a seismic level. But below that warmth, something else brewed, a quieter, colder energy, one that hadn't revealed itself yet, one that Eddie, with his relaxed poise and million-dollar confidence, was unknowingly walking straight toward. The interview began smoothly, almost too smoothly. Eddie, with his trademark wit, launched into stories from behind the scenes of his latest project. The audience laughed at every perfectly timed punchline. Even the panel leaned in closer, captivated. His charisma didn't just fill the room, it seemed to take command of it. He spoke fondly of his cast, his crew, the creative process. He talked about early mornings on set, unexpected bloopers, and moments that reminded him why he fell in love with storytelling in the first place, after all these years. Eddie said, his eyes gleaming under the studio lights, "I still feel that spark. There's a certain magic in creating something that makes people feel, something that gives them an escape for a moment. That feeling never gets old." Sarah Haynes nodded in full agreement. "That integrity shines through in your work. You've connected with so many generations because you speak to something universal." Eddie smiled thoughtfully. "Comedy is a universal language. People need to laugh. If I can offer that release, that moment of joy, then I've done my part." The studio hummed with agreement. It was shaping up to be one of those rare interviews, uplifting, insightful, refreshingly genuine. Eddie's reflective tone mixed with his comedic timing created the perfect interview rhythm. Even the audience seemed entranced, but then, the shift, Joy Behar, who until now had remained unusually quiet, hovering at the edge of the conversation like a coiled wire, straightened in her chair. The air seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping by a few emotional degrees. Her expression changed, no longer neutral, no longer warm. Something sharper lurked behind her eyes, something that suggested she'd been waiting. Not listening, waiting. Then, with the precision of someone who knows exactly when to strike, she leaned forward. The suddenness of the movement felt almost predatory. Speaking of comedy, Eddie, her voice sliced directly through the warmth in the room. Not loud but heavy, not aggressive but loaded, not curious but calculated. The studio fell silent so fast it was as if someone had unplugged every sound in the building. Even Whoopi's smile faded just a little. Sarah shifted in her seat. The audience, sensing the incoming storm, leaned in, not with excitement, but with the uneasy anticipation people feel right before a glass hits the floor. Joy's tone carried manufactured concern, the kind that is less about the question and more about the impact of the blow. Her eyes stayed locked on Eddie, her posture signaling that whatever came next wasn't accidental. It was prepared, it was intentional, it was the spark that would ignite everything, and Eddie caught mid-breath, mid-smile, mid-moment of genuine connection, turned his attention toward her, unaware that the harmony of the interview was about to rupture. With that single sentence, the entire atmosphere inside the studio shifted. It wasn't gradual, no slow seep of tension building in the corners. It was instant, like someone had opened a door and allowed an icy wind to blast straight through the set. The warmth that had colored the room moments earlier evaporated, leaving behind a sharp, sterile chill that made everyone sit a little straighter. Eddie Murphy's smile didn't vanish, but it changed. What had moments ago been effortless and expansive tightened at the edges, a subtle but unmistakable sign of impact. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger. It was the reflex of a veteran performer, one who had spent decades on stages, in interviews, in the center of unpredictable moment. Registering the shift and preparing himself, a single microsecond of calculation flickered behind his eyes before he answered. Across the table, the other hosts exchanged alarmed looks. It happened in quick, darting glances, Whoopi's eyebrows lifting in disbelief, Sarah's eyes widening, Sunny covering her uncertainty with a polite half-smile that fooled absolutely no one. They all recognized what was happening. Joy wasn't merely asking a question. She was steering the show directly into turbulence, and there was no telling whether they were about to dip, crash, or explode. "I'm not sure I follow," Eddie said finally. His voice remained steady, smooth, grounded. Even now, as the ground shifted aggressively beneath him, he held on to the tone of a man who did not lose composure easily. He wasn't defensive, he wasn't rattled, but he was alert, and Joy knew she had landed the first blow, and she wasn't done. Joy leaned forward, that glint in her eyes growing sharper. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't journalistic rigor. It was the gleam of confrontation, of someone who believed she had cornered her opponent and was savoring the moment. The shift in her expression was stunning. The warmth she'd shown earlier had drained away, replaced with something firmer, colder, and fueled by self-appointed moral authority. "Your old stand-up jokes that are now considered offensive," she pressed. "Don't you feel an apology is owed to your audience?" The studio fell so quiet it was as if the cameras themselves were holding their breath. Eddie's expression froze in a polite, unreadable mask. His hands, resting calmly on the armrests, didn't move. But something in his posture shifted. A straightening of the spine, a quiet bracing, and that's when Whoopi stepped in. "Joy," she said gently, though the edge in her voice betrayed her worry. Whoopi was a veteran in her own right, both on screen and behind it, and she could sense when an interview was veering into a dangerous, unnecessary territory. "Perhaps we can focus on Eddie's new film." It was an olive branch, a lifeline, a subtle plea to ease the pressure cooker before it blew the lid off entirely. But Joy didn't take it. If anything, Whoopi's interjection seemed to fuel her further, as though stopping now would be an admission that she'd overstepped. Joy's chin lifted. Her voice grew firmer, louder, ringing with an unshakable certainty that she was the one steering a conversation the world desperately needed. "No," Joy declared, "this is a vital conversation. In this era of accountability, shouldn't public figures answer for their past?" The audience let out a low, collective sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a groan, but somewhere between shock and discomfort. They hadn't come for controversy. They'd come for Eddie Murphy, one of the greatest entertainers of all time. And suddenly they found themselves watching a confrontation that felt less like an interview and more like a courtroom cross-examination. Eddie finally shifted, not dramatically, not angrily, but with the deliberate, controlled movement of a man preparing to assert himself. His posture straightened, his shoulders squared, and his eyes, still calm, still polite, took on a new, unmistakable sharpness. He was done being blindsided. Eddie looked directly at Joy, the studio lights catching the edge of his focused expression. For a moment, the room seemed to pause around him. Even the cameras felt slower. The studio audience leaned in as one. Everyone, hosts, viewers, producers hiding behind the cameras, waited to see how this legendary performer would respond to such a pointed accusation. Accountability, Eddie repeated, his voice low but resonant, testing the word like he was weighing its true meaning. That's an important concept, but it has to be applied with honesty, with context, and with respect. Joy opened her mouth. Whether to interrupt or to prepare for her next strike was unclear. But Eddie continued before she could speak. My material came from a different time, he said. A time when comedians pushed boundaries, challenged norms, and spoke from the culture they lived in. Comedy evolves. Society evolves. We all evolve. His tone remained controlled, measured, but the authority in it was unmistakable. That doesn't mean I dismiss anyone who felt offended, he added. People feel things, audiences change, that's natural, but to judge decades, old work by today's standards without acknowledging the world it came from, that's not accountability, that's rewriting history. A quiet ripple moved through the audience, approval, maybe even admiration. Besides, Eddie continued with a wry half smile. If comedians apologized every time someone got upset, none of us would ever stop apologizing. Whoopi stifled a laugh. Sarah exhaled with visible relief. Sunny nodded, her expression softening. The room thawed, slowly at first, then more quickly, as Eddie reasserted control of the conversation. Joy, however, sat stiffly in her chair, caught between defending her stance and recognizing that Eddie had effortlessly regained the upper hand. The confrontation she'd tried to engineer had shifted, slipping out of her grasp and settling squarely onto the shoulders of the man she'd tried to corner. And Eddie, poised and calm, made it clear that he wasn't here to be cornered by anyone. The easygoing guest who had walked onto the stage minutes earlier was gone. In his place now sat a man defending not just his career, but his legacy, decades of work, risk, evolution, and artistry. Eddie Murphy's expression had hardened into something resolute, the calm surface giving way to the steel beneath. "Let me be perfectly clear, Joy," he said, his voice deeper, anchored by 4 decades of experience. "I've been in comedy for over 40 years. My job, my responsibility, is to push boundaries, but at whose expense?" Joy snapped back immediately, cutting through his words with escalating aggression. Her volume rose, her posture sharpened, as if each question was a stepping stone in a battle she fully intended to win. "Those boundaries you pushed left a mark on people." Eddie didn't flinch, he didn't recoil. Instead, he leaned in just slightly, not in hostility but in certainty. "Comedy is a mirror to society," he replied. His tone remained level, but the edge in it was undeniable now, a quiet steel reinforcing every syllable. "Comedians reflect the world, not dictate it. If we start erasing art based on the shifting sands of social opinion, then tell me, where does it stop?" The audience barely breathed. It was the kind of silence that only arrives when something electric unfolds, something unpredictable, something real. The tension stretched so thin that even a whisper might have snapped it. Joy, however, seemed energized by the volatility. She leaned back in her chair, arms folding with the smug satisfaction of someone convinced she'd maneuvered her opponent into checkmate. A triumphant smirk curled on her lips. "So," she said, drawing the word out with pointed precision, "you're saying you have zero regrets about any of it?" Eddie didn't hesitate. "I'm saying," he answered, his voice resonating with a grounded authority, "that I stand by my body of work, every chapter of it. I've grown, I've evolved, as we all do, but I will not apologize for being part of the history of comedy." There was no anger in his tone, but there was conviction, deep, unwavering, immovable. It hung in the air like a bell's final note. You could have cut the atmosphere in the studio with a knife. The silence wasn't just stunned, it was heavy. Dense, the kind of silence that held weight, meaning, consequence. The audience sat frozen, as if unwilling to let even their own breathing interrupt what they were witnessing. They weren't just watching an interview, they were watching a public reckoning, a clash of ideology and ego unfolding live before them. The other hosts looked utterly powerless, reduced to spectators in a firefight raging at center stage. Whoopi's eyes darted anxiously between the two combatants. Sarah sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. and Sunny's gaze remained fixed on the table, her discomfort unmistakable. Nothing they could say would de-escalate what Joy had intentionally set in motion. "That's a very convenient way to sidestep responsibility," Joy sneered. The contempt in her voice was naked now, stripped of any pretense of objectivity. Her expression hardened, her posture rigid with moral indignation. Convenient wasn't a question, wasn't even a challenge. It was an accusation. Eddie's jaw tightened, the muscle flicking beneath his skin. It was the first visible crack in his otherwise impenetrable composure, a flash of frustration that even a seasoned performer couldn't fully conceal. "Convenient," he repeated, his voice low, controlled, but unmistakably simmering. "You think it's convenient to be ambushed on national television." A murmur rippled through the audience, quiet but unmistakable. Shock, agreement, discomfort. Every person in the room felt the sudden spike in intensity. Eddie hadn't raised his voice, but the impact of his words hit with the force of a slammed door. Joy opened her mouth, but for the first time she faltered. Eddie's declaration had shifted the balance of power in the room, if only by an inch. The dominant narrative she'd been trying to force had been disrupted. The audience felt it, the hosts felt it, and Joy herself seemed momentarily thrown off balance. Eddie pressed on, not waiting for her to recover. "I came here," he continued, "to talk about my work now, about the film, about the people who poured their talent into it, about creativity and craft. Not to stand trial for jokes I made decades ago in a world that looked completely different." His tone wasn't defensive, it was tired. Not the exhaustion of weakness, but the exhaustion of someone who had fought too many battles like this one, and was weary of their predictability. Joy folded her arms tighter, almost as if physically shielding her stance. "People were hurt," she shot back. "You can't just dismiss that." "And I'm not dismissing anything," Eddie said firmly, "but you're talking about the past like it's a crime scene instead of a point in time. Context matters, intention matters, growth matters." The audience murmured again, louder this time. Sympathy for Eddie, discomfort with Joy, and the raw tension of witnessing an exchange that had spiraled far beyond professional bounds. For 40 years. Eddie continued, "I've made people laugh, lifted them up when they needed it, given them joy, real joy. That's my legacy. That's what I stand on. Not a single clip you want to pull out and dissect under a microscope." Joy's eyes narrowed. "You think that excuses everything?" "No," Eddie replied evenly. "But I do think it means I deserve to be treated like a human being, not a headline you're trying to create." The studio erupted. Some gasps, some applause, some stunned silence. The temperature of the room had changed again, but now it burned with heat rather than cold. Eddie wasn't just defending himself. He was taking back control of the narrative, reclaiming the dignity that Joy had tried so hard to strip away. And the world, watching, could feel it. Eddie's voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. The low, controlled force behind his words hit with more impact than shouting ever could. For the first time since Joy had launched her attack, the studio audience reacted with audible shock. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room like a sudden gust of wind. Even people watching from home would have felt the shift, sharp, sudden, seismic. Joy straightened defensively, chin lifting with indignation. "I'm asking the tough questions," she snapped back, but her answer, thin, brittle, cracked under the weight of Eddie's accusation. It wasn't the reply of someone advocating for truth. It was the reply of someone trying to maintain control of a spectacle she had been enjoying far too much. "No," Eddie corrected, his voice steady but now heavy with authority. It commanded the room. "You're not asking questions. You're leveling accusations." The power dynamic flipped right then and there. You could see it. You could feel it. Joy, who moments earlier held the upper hand, suddenly looked smaller, not physically, but in presence. Eddie had reclaimed the terrain she thought she owned, and he was only beginning. "Do you hold every comedian to this retroactive standard?" he continued. "Or is it just the one sitting in this chair today?" Joy opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The silence she produced only amplified Eddie's point. The other hosts sat frozen, died, stunned. Any attempt to intervene now would be futile. A feeble gesture from bystanders witnessing a battle they had no power to stop. But Eddie wasn't done. He shifted slightly, not in aggression but in precision, and locked his gaze directly onto Joy. The change in his posture made the entire room lean in. "Let me ask you something, Joy," he said, his tone razor sharp. "In your long career, have you ever said a single thing someone somewhere might find offensive?" Joy blinked, her expression faltering. "Tell me," Eddie pressed on, "have you ever told a joke that didn't land a few years later? Ever made a comment you'd phrase differently today? Because if we're opening these books for a public audit, then every single page gets examined. Wouldn't you agree?" It was a devastating question, calmly delivered, perfectly timed, and it landed with the force of a spotlight turning onto the one person who had hoped to remain comfortably in the shadows. Joy's face flushed deep crimson. The transformation was startling. Gone was the smug mask of superiority, replaced instead by something raw, almost panicked. She had walked Eddie into a corner only to find herself trapped in the very trap she'd built. "That is entirely different," Joy sputtered. The words came out in a breathless stutter, stripped of her earlier confidence. Her voice trembled with the unmistakable panic of someone suddenly held to their own impossible standards. "Different," Eddie repeated, arching an eyebrow in a slow, theatrical gesture that drew a ripple of laughter. Nervous, relieved, supportive. From the audience. "Is that a fact? My work has never been the kind of material you've produced." Joy insisted, clinging to the last remnants of her crumbling argument. Eddie gave her a look, half disbelief, half pity. "Is that so?" he said. His tone remained composed, but the undercurrent of skepticism was unmistakable. "So you're saying you've never, not once, cracked a joke about someone's appearance, where they come from, what they believe? You've never uttered a single word that might have bruised an ego or made someone feel out of place?" Joy's lips pressed together, her face reddening further. She looked cornered, exposed, stripped of the confidence she'd worn like armor minutes earlier. The audience reacted again, a mix of gasps and murmurs. They knew the truth. Everyone did. Joy Behar had made a career out of bold, biting commentary. For her to claim moral purity was not just disingenuous. It was laughably impossible. Eddie's composure remained absolute. He didn't attack. He didn't insult. He simply held up a mirror, giving Joy a taste of the scrutiny she had hurled at him with such arrogance. And she did not like what she saw. The tension at the table had reached a breaking point. The air pulsed with the heat of a confrontation that had spun far beyond anyone's expectations. Eddie's words weren't loud, but they were powerful, precision strikes that cut through Joy's defenses with brutal efficiency. Sensing disaster on the horizon, Whoopi lunged back into the conversation, like someone trying to grab a steering wheel moments before impact. "Perhaps we should all just take a breath," Whoopi said, her voice gentle but urgent. "Let's remember we're supposed to be on the same side here." Her plea hung in the air for a moment, a last-ditch attempt to regain control of a train that had already barreled off the track. But the damage was done. The confrontation had escalated to a level no one on the set, except maybe Joy, had ever intended. The other hosts sat silent, pale, almost defeated, watching the flames dance higher. Joy still fumed, breathing hard, her jaw tight with stubborn defiance. Eddie remained calm, collected, and firmly in command. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud him, defend Joy, or simply try to process the storm they had witnessed. One thing was clear: this was no longer just a tense interview. It was a reckoning, a showdown, a live, televised collision of ego, principle, and the raw truth no one expected Eddie Murphy to deliver with such lethal precision.